Content warning. This episode discusses murder and domestic conflict. Listener discretion is advised. In the small hours of the 19th of August, 1990, the last guests of a wedding reception were finally leaving Camp Nelson Lodge, a rustic mountain retreat tucked into the Sierra Nevada in Tulare County, California. The band had packed up. The dance floor was empty. And in her private cabin on the property, the lodge's owner, a woman named Bonnie Hood, was finally able to go to bed after a long night of hosting. She never woke up. Sometime around 3 in the morning, gunshots rang out in that cabin. When help arrived, Bonnie Hood was dead. Her groundskeeper, a man named Rudy Manuel, was found badly wounded, a bullet lodged in his head, somehow still alive, and just barely able to tell investigators what he thought he'd seen. What followed was a case that would twist and double back on itself for years, through a sensational trial, a stunning acquittal, and then, extraordinarily, an entirely separate killing carried out in what looked, to some, like an act of vigilante justice. By the time the legal system had finished with this case, one man had walked free forever for Bonnie's murder, no matter what anyone believed about his guilt. And the man who couldn't accept that outcome would end up behind bars himself for a different killing entirely. To this day, officially, nobody has ever been convicted of killing Bonnie Hood. Part 1. A mountain retreat Camp Nelson is the kind of place people go to get away from everything else. Perched in the Sierra Nevada mountains of Tulare County, California, it's a small, quiet community, the sort of spot where the nearest city feels like a different world entirely. In June of 1987, that quiet little mountain settlement became the site of a fresh start for a couple named Jim and Bonnie Hood. Jim Hood was a real estate developer, successful enough to be based out of the affluent coastal community of Newport Beach, hours away from the mountains. Bonnie was his wife, by all early accounts, an equal partner in whatever project the two of them decided to take on. And in 1987, after some complicated financial dealings involving the property's previous ownership, the Hoods purchased Camp Nelson Lodge outright, taking over what had been an established mountain resort and turning it into their own business. The arrangement the Hoods settled into was, on its face, a common one for couples running a business like this. Bonnie relocated to Camp Nelson full-time, living on-site and managing the lodge's daily operations, welcoming guests, running events, keeping the whole rustic operation ticking over. Jim, meanwhile, largely stayed behind in Newport Beach, continuing his development work, making the trip up to the mountains when business or family required it. To the people who encountered them, the Hoods looked, in the words of one journalist who later covered the case, like a seemingly perfect couple, 2 grown children, a comfortable lifestyle split between a beautiful coastal community and a charming mountain lodge, the kind of life a lot of people would consider enviable. It's exactly the sort of surface impression that makes what happened next so genuinely unsettling, because almost nobody watching the Hoods from the outside saw any of it coming. By the summer of 1990, Bonnie Hood was 46 years old, well established as the face and operator of Camp Nelson Lodge. On the 18th of August that year, the lodge hosted a large wedding reception, a full, lively event that kept the property busy late into the evening, with staff and guests moving in and out of the main buildings and grounds well past sundown. Working that night, as he often did, was Rudy Manuel, the lodge's groundskeeper, a 35-year-old man from the nearby Tule River Indian Reservation, who had become a familiar, trusted presence around the property. Part 2. The shooting in the early hours of the 19th of August, 1990, somewhere around 3 in the morning, once the wedding festivities had finally wound down and the last of the guests had gone home. Gunshots were fired inside Bonnie Hood's private cabin. Bonnie was killed. Rudy Manuel, who was also inside the cabin at the time, was shot in the head. It was, by any measure, a catastrophic wound, the kind investigators would ordinarily expect to be fatal. But Rudy survived it. Grievously injured, he was somehow still able to reach a phone and call for help, giving investigators a detail that would become one of the very few solid leads in the entire case. He told them the shooter had been driving a red Jeep. When investigators arrived at the scene, they found Bonnie in the bedroom area of the cabin and Rudy in the living room, wounded by what forensic examination would identify as a bullet fired from a .38 caliber revolver. Crime scene investigators collected blood evidence and fingerprints, working methodically through a scene that, on its face, looked at first like it could have been a robbery gone catastrophically wrong. But the longer investigators examined the scene, the less that explanation held up. Nothing of obvious value appeared to have been taken from the cabin. There was no sign of the kind of frantic, opportunistic ransacking you'd typically expect from a robbery interrupted by an unexpected witness. Instead, the attack had the hallmarks of something far more deliberate and targeted. Two specific people, shot in a specific location, with nothing else in the cabin disturbed. That shift in thinking, from opportunistic crime to something far more calculated, set the entire subsequent investigation on a very different course. Part 3. A name surfaces as investigators worked through Rudy Manuel's account of what he remembered from that night. Along with the physical evidence recovered from the scene, they were led toward a specific suspect, a man named Bruce Edward Beauchamp. Beauchamp had a connection to the case that went beyond a stranger passing through. He had previously worked for Jim Hood. That fact alone wasn't necessarily damning on its own, but combined with the other threads investigators were pulling together, it helped crystallize him as their primary suspect. Rudy Manuel, in a photo lineup, identified Beauchamp as the man who had shot him. And a search of Beauchamp's residence turned up a receipt for a pair of shoes that matched boot prints recovered from the crime scene. It was enough, in the eyes of investigators, to move forward. Bruce Beauchamp was arrested and charged with the murder of Bonnie Hood and the attempted murder of Rudy Manuel. It was during this period, while Beauchamp sat in custody, that a genuinely uncomfortable rumor began circulating around the case, one that would come to define much of the public fascination with it in the years that followed. Given Beauchamp's prior working relationship with Jim Hood, and given whispers about the state of the Hood's marriage, speculation began to build around a far darker possible explanation for Bonnie's death. Not a random act of violence at all, but a planned, paid hit, one that Jim Hood himself might have arranged. It's important to be precise here, because this is a detail that has followed the case for over 3 decades, and it deserves to be stated accurately rather than sensationally. Jim Hood has never been charged with arranging his wife's murder. The hit-for-hire theory has never been proven in any court. It remained, throughout Beauchamp's prosecution and in the years afterward, exactly what it started as: a persistent, unresolved rumor, fueled by circumstance and connection, but never substantiated by evidence strong enough to bring formal charges. Part 4. The trial and an acquittal. Bruce Beauchamp's trial for the murder of Bonnie Hood got underway, built largely around 2 central pillars of evidence: Rudy Manuel's identification of him as the shooter and the physical bootprint evidence connecting him to the scene. But the prosecution's case ran into serious trouble once it reached the courtroom, and the trouble centered on Rudy Manuel himself. During his testimony, questions arose about a rumored affair between Rudy and Bonnie Hood, a detail that, if true, could have offered an entirely different motive and complicated the picture investigators had built. When pressed on the subject at trial, Rudy refused to acknowledge any such affair, a denial that, whether or not it reflected the truth, seriously undermined his credibility as the prosecution's central witness. If jurors couldn't fully trust what Rudy Manuel was telling them about his own relationship with the victim, It became that much harder for them to feel confident relying on his identification of her killer. Without a fully credible eyewitness, and without any other evidence strong enough to close the gap on its own, the case against Bruce Beauchamp began to fall apart. On the 29th of March, 1991, a jury returned its verdict, not guilty on all charges. Bruce Beauchamp walked free. And because of a foundational protection in American law, the prohibition against double jeopardy, that verdict effectively closed the door on Bonnie Hood's case forever, at least as far as Bruce Beauchamp was concerned. No matter what new evidence might surface in the future, no matter how suspicions about him might shift or harden over time, Beauchamp could never be tried again for Bonnie's murder. He had been acquitted, and under the law, that was final. It's one of the more painful, purely legal ironies embedded in this entire case. Whatever the truth actually was about who killed Bonnie Hood on that August night in 1990, the one specific door through which the justice system might have delivered a formal answer had just been permanently sealed shut. Part 5. A year later, for roughly a year after Beauchamp's acquittal, the case of Bonnie Hood's murder sat in exactly the kind of unresolved limbo that so often defines cases where an acquittal leaves lingering public suspicion behind. Beauchamp was, in the eyes of the law, a free and innocent man. But in the eyes of at least one person connected to Bonnie's life, that legal outcome apparently settled nothing at all. On the 22nd of March, 1992, Bruce Beauchamp was shot to death inside his own office. The man responsible was Jim Hood, Bonnie's widower. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary turn for a case that had already taken one deeply unusual path through the legal system. A man acquitted of murdering someone's wife, unable to ever be retried for that killing no matter what new suspicion emerged, was now dead himself, killed by the victim's own husband, in what Jim Hood would initially describe to police as an act of self-defense. Whatever had actually happened inside that office on the day of the shooting, Jim Hood's account of it would prove, over the course of the legal proceedings that followed, to be a great deal more complicated and considerably less consistent than a straightforward claim of self-defense. Part 6. 2 trials. Jim Hood's prosecution for the killing of Bruce Beauchamp unfolded across 2 separate trials, spanning almost 2 years. The first trial began in October of 1992. Despite the emotionally charged backstory hanging over the entire proceeding, a husband, still widely believed by many to have lost his wife to a contract killing, taking justice into his own hands against the man once accused, then acquitted of that very crime, the jury in that first trial couldn't reach a unanimous verdict. It ended in a hung jury, forcing the case to be tried all over again. Jim Hood's second trial began in June of 1993. This time, when Jim took the stand to describe what had happened in Bruce Beauchamp's office, his account of events had noticeably shifted from what he'd originally told police and testified to in the first trial. According to reporting on the case, this change appears to have been prompted, at least in part, by testimony from his first trial establishing that his original version of events simply wasn't physically possible. It was a decision that would come back to haunt him in the courtroom. Prosecutors brought in jurors who had actually sat through Jim Hood's first trial, specifically to testify about the discrepancies between what he'd said the first time and what he was now telling the second jury. It's a genuinely striking moment in the history of this case, a defendant's own prior testimony, and the memories of the jurors who'd originally heard it being used against him in a completely separate trial, to demonstrate that his story had changed once he'd learned his first version couldn't hold up. The second jury wasn't persuaded by Jim Hood's revised account. In February of 1994, he was found guilty of murder for the killing of Bruce Beauchamp. He was subsequently sentenced to 27 years to life in prison, with an additional 2 years added for the use of a firearm in the commission of the offense. Part 7. What was left unresolved, Jim Hood ultimately served 23 years of that sentence. In April of 2017, he was released on parole. And here is where this case leaves us. More than 3 decades after Bonnie Hood was killed in her own bedroom on a busy wedding night at the lodge she and her husband had built together, nobody has ever been convicted of her murder. Bruce Beauchamp, the man once identified by an eyewitness and connected to the crime scene through physical evidence, was acquitted and protected forever afterward by double jeopardy from ever facing that specific charge again. He never got the chance to answer for it in any other way either, because within roughly a year of his acquittal, he was dead, shot by Bonnie's own husband, in an act that a jury would eventually determine wasn't self-defense at all, but murder. And Jim Hood himself, despite the persistent rumor, followed for decades, that he may have orchestrated a contract killing against his own wife, has never been charged in connection with Bonnie's death. That theory remains exactly what it always was, a widely discussed, deeply suspicious, but ultimately unproven thread in a case already tangled with more legal complexity than almost any other double homicide in recent California history. It's worth pausing at the end of a story this knotted with legal twists and courtroom drama to remember that at the very center of it is a 46-year-old woman who ran a mountain lodge, hosted a wedding, and went to bed after a long night of work and never had the chance to wake up. Whatever the truth actually is about who wanted Bonnie Hood dead and why, the justice system, across 2 separate homicide investigations and 3 separate trials, was never quite able to deliver a conviction for the crime that started it all. Rudy Manuel survived a bullet to the head and lived to describe what he saw that night, a red Jeep, a face he was certain he recognized. But the credibility fight over his own personal life ultimately meant his testimony wasn't enough to make a murder charge stick. Bruce Beauchamp walked out of a courtroom a free man, only to be shot dead a little over a year later by someone who apparently couldn't accept that verdict as the final word. And Jim Hood, having served over 2 decades in prison for that killing, walked free himself in 2017, never having been forced to answer in any courtroom for the rumor that has followed him for more than 30 years. Camp Nelson Lodge itself didn't survive the fallout of any of this intact either. In the years following the case, Jim Hood deeded the property to his attorney, and it was eventually lost to foreclosure and sold on to new owners entirely. One more piece of the Hood's life together that didn't make it out the other side of what happened in that cabin. Bonnie Jean Hood was 46 years old. She built a mountain lodge with her husband, made it a home, and hosted other people's happiest days right up until the last night of her life. More than 30 years later, the question of exactly who pulled the trigger in her bedroom that August morning remains, officially, unanswered. Thank you for listening.